The sun hung high in the sky, casting golden rays across the sprawling playground where the air buzzed with the carefree laughter of children. The freshly mown grass tickled the senses with its crisp scent, mingling with the earthy aroma of mulch piled beneath the swings and slides. It was one of those rare, perfect Saturdays, an unspoken promise of peace for families who flocked to the park. Mothers lingered near the benches, their voices weaving a soft tapestry of small talk, while fathers dotted the open field, tossing footballs and frisbees with practiced ease. For most, it was a day to unwind, to steal a fleeting moment of joy from the chaos of life. But for Maya Carter, standing near the edge of the playground, it was something else entirely, a quiet mission, a duty she carried deep in her bones. Maya adjusted the collar of her denim jacket, the fabric brushing against her neck as she tilted her head to watch her nephew Elijah, perched atop the jungle gym like a tiny king surveying his domain. His wild curls danced in the breeze, catching the sunlight in a halo of untamed energy. His bright, searching eyes found hers, and she offered a warm smile, lifting her thumb in a gesture of encouragement. At 10 years old, Elijah was a whirlwind, curious, bold, and sometimes too trusting for his own good. That spark in him both filled her with pride and gnawed at her with worry. She saw so much of herself in him, but also the innocence she'd long since had to shed. Today, though, she wanted to shield him from the weight of the world. Today, she wanted him to just be a kid, to climb and laugh and run without a care. At 36, Maya carried herself with a quiet strength that seemed to hum beneath her skin. Her caramel-toned complexion glowed under the sun, and her natural curls framed a face that could shift from gentle warmth to steely resolve in an instant. She was a protector, forged in the fires of a life that demanded resilience. Years in law enforcement had honed her instincts, teaching her to read people, to sense danger before it struck. But it was more than training, it was survival, shaped by the unspoken battles of being a black woman in a world that often refused to see her worth. She'd clawed her way through barriers, proving herself again and again to those who dared to doubt her. Beneath her polished exterior lay a story of grit raised by a single mother who scrubbed floors and stitched dreams late into the night. Maya knew the sting of struggle, the ache of being underestimated, and she'd turned it into fuel. The playground pulsed with life around her, a symphony of squeals and chatter, until a voice sharp and thunderous shouted the harmony. "Get your hands off the kid." It cut through the air like a blade, reverberating across the open space. Heads snapped toward the sound, parents freezing mid-conversation, children pausing with toys dangling in their hands. The laughter that had danced moments ago dissolved into a tense, suffocating silence. Maya's heart lurched as she turned, her eyes locking onto the scene unfolding just yards away. A police officer loomed over a woman, his meaty hand clamped around her arm with a grip that seemed to dare her to fight back. His uniform stretched tight across his broad shoulders, a badge glinting ominously in the sunlight. The woman's breath caught in her chest, her body stiffening under his hold, but her face Her face burned with a fury she could barely contain. "You don't get to bark orders here," the officer snarled, his voice dripping with venom as he shoved her back a step. The force of it made her stumble, her sneakers scuffing the mulch, but she didn't fall. "I don't care who you think you are. This isn't your kid, and you're not taking him anywhere." Her chest heaved, a storm brewing behind her eyes. "He's my nephew," she said, her voice steady but trembling with the effort to keep it from breaking. "Let go of me." The words were measured, deliberate, but beneath them simmered a rage that threatened to spill over. She could feel the heat of his grip searing into her skin, the indignity of it clawing at her insides. She wasn't just angry, she was humiliated, exposed in front of strangers who watched with wide eyes and hushed breaths. The officer's lip curled into a sneer, his contempt palpable. "Don't lie to me," he spat, his words laced with a bitterness that felt personal. "People like you don't belong here. I see it all the time, trying to blend in, pretending to be something you're not. You're lucky I haven't cuffed you yet." His accusation hung heavy in the air, a dagger aimed at her very existence. Around them, the small crowd that had gathered at the playground's edge shifted uncomfortably. A woman in yoga pants clutched her purse tighter, her knuckles whitening as she watched. A man in a crisp business suit edged closer, his brow furrowed, but his feet stayed rooted. No one moved to help, no one dared. Maya's heart thundered in her chest, a frantic rhythm that drowned out the distant hum of the park. She wouldn't back down, not now, not ever. "Let me go," she said again, her voice cracking as tears pricked her eyes. But they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of fury, hot and defiant, born from a lifetime of moments like this. The officer smirked, leaning in close enough that she could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "Or what?" he taunted, his tone mocking her powerlessness. What happened next unfolded in a blur, a violent burst of motion, too swift to process. His knee slammed into the back of her leg, forcing her down with a jolt that sent pain radiating through her body. She hit the mulch hard, the jagged chips digging into her knees. But it was the humiliation that cut deepest. Whispers rippled through the crowd, soft murmurs of shock, of disbelief, and yet no one stepped forward. She could feel their eyes on her, judging, pitying, but not one soul moved to her aid. The officer towered over her, his shadow swallowing the sunlight. "You're under arrest for resisting a lawful order," he declared, yanking cuffs from his belt with a metallic clink. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "Stop!" A small, desperate voice pierced the air, trembling but fierce. Elijah. He'd broken free from the slide, his sneakers pounding the ground as he ran toward her, tears streaming down his flushed cheeks. She didn't do anything. His tiny frame shook with emotion. His fists clenched as he tried to reach her. The officer whirled, stepping between them with a growl. "Get back," he barked, his voice a whip crack that made Elijah flinch. "Enough!" Maya's voice erupted, raw and unfiltered, a primal roar that clawed its way out of her chest. Ignoring the searing pain in her knee, she rose to her feet, her body trembling, but her resolve unbreakable. She locked eyes with the officer, her gaze a blazing inferno. "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" she demanded, her words sharp enough to slice through the tension. The crowd grew thicker now, phones raised like silent witnesses, capturing every second. Elijah's sobs echoed in her ears, each one a dagger to her heart. But the officer's focus remained fixed on her, unyielding. "I know exactly what I'm doing," he said coldly, his voice a slab of ice. "And if you don't get on the ground right now, I'll make sure you regret it." His threat hung between them, a promise of more violence, more shame. Tears threatened to spill down her cheeks, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Instead, she did something that stopped him cold. With slow, deliberate movements, she reached into her bag, her fingers steady despite the storm raging inside her. She pulled out an ID badge, the gold letters catching the sunlight as they gleamed. FBI Special Agent in charge. The officer's face drained of color, his bravado crumbling like dry earth. His hand faltered on the cuffs, doubt flickering in his eyes for the first time. Maya straightened, her voice steady but trembling with barely contained rage. "You just assaulted a federal agent," she said, each word a hammer strike. "And that's only the beginning of your problems." The crowd stirred at last, whispers swelling into murmurs, phones zooming in to capture the shift in power. The officer opened his mouth, but no sound came out, as authority unraveling before their eyes. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper meant only for him. "You think this ends here? You think you can walk away from this? You have no idea who I am or what I can do." Her words were a promise, a vow etched in steel. He stumbled back, his confidence shattered, but it was too late. The cameras had seen it all. The whispers turned into shouts: "Racist! Thug! Fire him!" The crowd's outrage finally breaking free. His world began to crumble, piece by piece, under the weight of his own actions. But Maya stood firm, unshaken. She wasn't done in it by a long shot, because what came next would rip apart everything he thought he knew. This wasn't just about her, or Elijah, or even the badge she carried. It was about justice, a force as relentless as she was. The question wasn't whether he'd pay for what he'd done. The question was how far she'd go to ensure that he did, to make him feel the consequences of his abuse of power. And as the wind carried the faint echoes of children's laughter once more, it whispered a truth: those who wield authority without mercy will one day face its reckoning. For Maya, that day was now, and she would see it through to the end. The sting of being overlooked, the quiet ache of doubt shadowing her every step. and the harsh sting of judgment crashing down before she could even open her mouth. These weren't just fleeting moments for Maya Carter, they were the fire that forged her. She didn't just dream of success in some vague, distant way. She hungered to carve out a legacy, to shift the world even slightly on its axis. Rising through the ranks of the FBI with a relentless drive, she'd become one of the youngest special agents in charge, a title that carried the weight of countless sleepless nights and hard-won victories. She stood at the helm of sprawling operations, her voice steady as she directed teams through chaos, earning nods of respect from colleagues who'd seen her prove herself time and again. But beneath that respect simmered a current of resentment, a silent friction that trailed her like a shadow into every briefing room and field assignment. Maya had grown adept at reading with tight lips, the sit-along glances, and she'd learned to move through it with a grace that masked the effort it took. Yet beyond the crisp suits and the badge clipped to her belt, there was another Maya, one who shed the armor of her title as easily as she slipped off her shoes at the end of a long day. She was Auntie Maya, the one who never missed Elijah's soccer games, cheering louder than anyone from the sidelines even when her throat was raw. She was the woman who fumbled through cookie recipes in her small kitchen, laughing with Elijah as they scraped dough off the counter, after yet another batch emerged from the oven more charred than edible. She was the steady hand that had knelt beside him when he was 4, patiently guiding his tiny fingers through the loops of his shoelaces until he beamed with pride. At mastering the knot, her sister Jasmine had placed an unshakable trust in her, a bond Maya carried like a sacred vow. That's why, on a sunlit afternoon when Elijah's soccer practice wrapped up, she'd promised to swing by and scoop him up, their tradition of ice cream cones waiting just ahead. His wide, pleading eyes had softened her resolve at the mention of the park, and despite the tug of exhaustion pulling at her, she'd caveat because, when it came to Elijah, her heart always bent before it broke. The park buzzed with the hum of late afternoon, children shrieking as they darted across the grass, parents chatting in loose clusters, the air thick with the scent of fresh mulch and distant barbecue smoke. Maya leaned against a weathered bench, her arms crossed casually as she watched Elijah scramble up the jungle gym, his laughter slicing through the ordinary noise like a bell. She didn't clock the officer at first. He was just another figure woven into the tapestry of the Sinenevy uniform, crisp against the blur of colorful jackets and strollers. His presence unremarkable amid the crowd, but years in law enforcement had honed her instincts into something sharp and unerring, and soon a prickle of unease crept up her spine. It was subtle at first, a whisper of wrongness she couldn't quite place, until her gaze sharpened and she caught it, the way his eyes tracked her, not casually, not absently, but with a focus that felt like a spotlight pinning her in place. His stance was too rigid, his shoulders squared in a way that spoke of coiled intent rather than idle patrol. She shook it off, turning her attention back to Elijah as he whooped down the slide. But the weight of that stare lingered, a splinter she couldn't dislodge. Officer Ryan Daniels moved through the world like a man armored in bitterness. His uniform stretched tight across a frame that had once carried youthful swagger, but now bore the slump of disillusionment. 7 years on the force had etched lines into his face, a map of frustrations he no longer bothered to hide. At 38, he was a man who'd long since stopped believing in the promises his badge once held. He'd grown up in a sleepy small town where a uniform meant instant respect, where the heft of a gun at his hip made him somebody. He'd carried that expectation with him into the city, clinging to it like a lifeline, only to watch it unravel. The reverence he'd once taken for granted had curdled into wary glances from strangers, the admiration he'd expected replaced by a quiet, pervasive fear. Over time, that shift had hardened him, twisting his view until he no longer saw faces in the crowd, just potential threats, lurking behind every smile. When his eyes landed on Maya that afternoon, something in him bristled. She didn't fit the picture he'd painted of the park's usual crowd. Too poised, too self-assured, her presence grated against the edges of his frayed patience. He watched her with Elijah, his jaw tightening as suspicion took root, fed by biases he'd stopped questioning long ago. Maya didn't sense him closing in until his shadow fell across her, a sudden eclipse that snuffed out the warmth of the sun on her skin. She turned, her posture shifting instinctively as she met his gaze. and the air between them thickened with tension. "Ma'am, I need to speak with you," he said, his voice a low rumble, threaded with an authority that felt more like accusation than inquiry. Her brows lifted slightly, a flicker of recognition passing through her. She'd heard that tone before, in interrogations, in standoffs, in moments when power flexed too hard. "Is there a problem, officer?" she replied, keeping her words even, though her stomach gave a faint twist. Ryan's gaze darted to Elijah, who just tumbled off the slide with a grin, oblivious to the storm brewing nearby. "You want to explain why you're here with that boy?" he pressed, his tone sharpening. Maya's breath caught, a spark of protectiveness flaring in her chest. "He's my nephew," she said, her voice firm but calm, a shield against the implication hanging in his words. Ryan's hand drifted to his holster, fingers brushing the leather as if it steadied him. "I'm going to need some ID," he said, his eyes narrowing into slits. She reached for her purse with deliberate slowness, her movements a quiet defiance against the urgency in his stance. "I don't mind showing you ID," she said, her tone measured, "but is there a reason you're asking?" His response came fast, a snap of irritation breaking through his composure. "Don't get defensive. Just show me your ID." Elijah wandered closer then, his sneakers scuffing the dirt, his face clouding with confusion as he took in the scene. "Eddie, what's going on?" he asked, his voice small and quavering. Ryan's head didn't turn, but his eyes darkened, and he barked, "Step back, kid." Maya's spine stiffened, a surge of anger cutting through her restraint. "Don't talk to him like that," she said, her words slicing the air with a precision that made Ryan flinch. He stepped closer, looming over her now, his chest puffed out as if her defiance had struck a nerve. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job," he shot back, his patience fraying with every syllable she uttered. What followed unfolded in a heartbeat yet stretched into an eternity. Ryan didn't like her voice, didn't like the way she held herself, didn't like the growing circle of onlookers craning their necks to watch. Before Maya could fully process the shift, his hand clamped around her arm, his grip iron tight and unyielding. Time seemed to stutter. Elijah's scream pierced the air, high and panicked, as Maya twisted against the hold. Ryan's knee drove into the back of her leg, forcing her down with a thud that jolted through her bones. She hit the ground hard, dirt grinding into her palms, the sharp sting of humiliation burning hotter than the pain radiating from her knee. Gasps rippled through the crowd, phones snapping up to record the chaos, their lenses glinting like unblinking eyes. Maya lifted her head, her breath ragged, and caught the flicker in Ryan's gaze, a fleeting crack of doubt, a whisper of realization that he might have misstepped, but it vanished as quickly as it came, swallowed by the steel of his resolve. The park had transformed in an instant. What had been a scattering of curious glances swelled into a throng of spectators, their murmurs buzzing like static around her. The weight of their stares pressed against Maya's ribs, a suffocating force she refused to let crush her. She clenched her jaw, swallowing the groan that threatened to escape as her knee throbbed beneath her. Elijah's cries cut through the noise, each sob a dagger twisting in her chest. She ached to reach for him, to pull him close and whisper that everything would be okay. But Ryan's bulk pinned her in place, his presence a wall she couldn't breach. His grip on her arm tightened, his knuckles blanching as he held her down, his knee pressing just enough to keep her subdued without crossing into overt brutality. Calculated restraint he'd likely defend later. "I said stay down," he growled, his voice a blade meant to carve away any resistance. Maya's pulse hammered in her ears, but she forced her words out, steady despite the tremor beneath them. "You're making a mistake," she said, her eyes locking onto his with a fire that refused to dim. Ryan leaned in, his breath a hot gust against her cheek, his face so close she could see the sweat beating at his temples. "The only mistake I made," he hissed, "was giving you the benefit of the doubt." Her fury surged, a molten wave churning just beneath her skin, and she met his glare with one of her own. "Let me go," she demanded, her voice low but unyielding. He didn't relent. Instead, he shoved her down harder, his free hand fumbling for the cuffs dangling from his belt. Elijah darted forward then, his small hands balled into fists, tears streaking his dirt-smudged face. "Don't hurt her. She didn't do anything," he cried. his voice breaking with desperation. Ryan's head snapped toward him, his expression twisting into something cold and sharp. "Back up. Kid, no," he barked, and Elijah recoiled, his shoulders trembling as fear swallowed his bravado. Maya's heart clenched as she watched him shrink back, his wide eyes glistening with terror. "He's scared," she said through gritted teeth, her voice raw with emotion. "Look at him, you're scaring him." Ryan's lips curled into a sneer, a cruel edge glinting in his eyes as he turned back to her. "Good," he said, his tone dripping with venom. "Maybe he'll learn something today." The words landed like a slap, igniting a fury in Maya that blazed past her pain, past her fear. She didn't know it yet, but this moment would unravel Ryan Daniels' world, thread by thread. He didn't know who she was, not her name, not her title, not the storm she could summon, but he would soon. And when that reckoning came, it would echo far beyond this park, a lesson in justice and the bitter cost of wielding power without care. For Maya, it was more than a clash with a man too blinded by his own resentment to see her. It was a reminder of why she fought, why she endured because the world needed those who wouldn't bow. Even when the ground rose up to meet them, every muscle in her body coiled tight, a wildfire of rage surging through her veins, urging her to lash out, to throw him off and demand retribution for the venom dripping from his words. But she couldn't not hear, not now. The stakes towered over her like a looming shadow, pressing down on her chest until every breath felt like a battle. Her eyes darted around, sweeping across the sea of faces in the crowd. Some wore masks of horror, their wide eyes reflecting the chaos unfolding before them. Others stood frozen, their uncertainty painted in the tight lines of their mouths. Yet no one moved. No one dared to raise a voice. The silence was a thick, suffocating fog, broken only when a woman's cry pierced through it. "Somebody call the police," her voice trembling with desperation. But then came Ryan's retort, sharp and commanding, slicing through the noise like a blade. "I am the police." The words hung there, heavy as lead, choking the air out of the park. Maya's breath snagged in her throat, a jagged lump she couldn't swallow. She'd crossed paths with men like him before, officers who wielded their badges, not as shields of honor, but as weapons, cloaking their cruelty in the guise of authority. Each encounter had left a scar on her spirit, a reminder of the arrogance that power could breed. But this time was different. This time, the crosshairs were locked on her. Ryan's grip tightened around her arm, yanking her upward with a roughness that sent a jolt of pain through her shoulders. The cold bite of handcuffs snapped around her wrists, metal digging into her skin like teeth. But she refused to flinch. "You think you're tough," he muttered, his breath hot and sour against her ear. "We'll see how tough you are when this is over." Her shoulders throbbed, the ache spreading like wildfire. But she locked her gaze on his, her jaw set firm. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her falter. "You don't know who you're messing with," she said, her voice steady as steel despite the sting clawing at her throat. Ryan's laugh was a hollow, brittle thing, echoing off the park's trees like a taunt. "That's where you're wrong. I know exactly who you reamed. You're nobody." The words cut deep, sharper than the cuffs, slicing into the core of her pride. But she didn't waver, not with Elijah's wide, tear-streaked eyes fixed on her from across the grass, not with the crowd's phones raised like silent judges, capturing every second. She held Ryan's stare, her defiance a blazing torch in the dimming light. Then came the sound of small, frantic footsteps. Elijah, her little brother, charging toward them, his voice cracking with panic. "No, don't take her, please." His tiny hands reached out, grasping at the air as if he could pull her back. Maya's heart twisted, a raw, wrenching ache blooming in her chest. She turned sharply, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Elijah, stay back. It's okay, baby. I promise it's okay." But the light tasted bitter on her tongue. Nothing about this was okay. Not the cold steel on her wrists, not the helplessness in Elijah's cries, not the smug curl of Ryan's lips as he shoved her into the patrol car. The door slammed shut with a clang that reverberated in her skull, muffling the world outside. Through the glass, she could still see Elijah, his small face pressed against the window, his sobs a faint, haunting echo. Her heart pounded, each beat a drum of fury and sorrow, but she forced her mind to sharpen, to focus. She wasn't broken yet. As the car lurched forward, Ryan adjusted the rearview mirror, his eyes catching hers in the reflection. "What's the matter? Not so tough anymore." His tone dripped with mockery, but Maya leaned forward, her voice a low, simmering threat. "You're going to regret this." He smirked, a flash of arrogance lighting his face. "I doubt it." But beneath that bravado, she saw a flicker of unease in the way his jaw tightened, the way his knuckles whitened as he gripped the wheel just a little too hard. He sensed something was off, a crack in the foundation of his control, though he couldn't yet name it, and that was her weapon. Maya's mind raced, a whirlwind of memories and instincts honed over years of facing high-stakes battles. Her career had forged her in fire confrontations where a cool head wasn't just an asset, but a lifeline. But this wasn't merely about survival. This was about justice, about dismantling the corrupt throne Ryan perched upon. The car rolled to a stop at the station, and as he opened the door, she caught the first real stumble in his confidencia, slight hesitation in his step, a shadow crossing his face. She stepped out deliberately, her head high, her gaze a piercing arrow that pinned him in place. Officers and staff turned to stare as Ryan marched her inside, their whispers buzzing like static in the air. Among them, she spotted a familiar face, Officer Torres, a man she'd collaborated with on a task force months ago. His eyes widened in recognition, a spark of shock igniting there before he froze, his glance darting nervously to Ryan. Maya's lips parted, a breath of hope rising. But Ryan jerked her arm forward. "Move," he snapped, his voice laced with irritation. The humiliation burned like acid in her veins, but she swallowed it, banking her anger for the moment it could strike true. He led her into an interrogation room, the door clicking shut behind them with a finality that echoed in the sterile space. Ryan's smirk returned, a predator circling its prey as he paced before her. "You think this is bad," he said, his voice thick with disdain. "Wait until you see what happens next." Maya didn't blink, her calm a shield against his bluster. "You're right," she replied, her tone even and edged with ice. "I don't think you're ready for what happens next." He stopped mid-step, his smirk faltering, a crack splintering through his facade. "What's that supposed to mean?" he demanded, but she only leaned back in her chair, the cuffs cutting into her wrists a dull ache she ignored. "You'll find out soon enough," she said, her words a quiet promise. For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes, a shadow of fear he couldn't mask. And that doubt was her foothold, the first step toward unraveling him. The room's dim light flickered overhead, casting jagged shadows across the gray walls, a fitting backdrop to the tension coiling between them. Ryan Daniels stood near the door, his posture stiff as iron, his jaw clenched so tightly it seemed his teeth might crack under the strain. The badge on his belt gleamed faintly, but it felt heavier now, a burden dragging at his waist. Across the table, Maya Carter sat with a stillness that belied the storm raging in her chest. Her eyes burned with a fierce, unyielding light, dissecting him with every glance, peeling away his armor until he stood bare before her judgment. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and forced, a desperate grab at control. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice taut but still clinging to authority. "You think you're running this show, but you're not. This ends now." Maya tilted her head, a subtle shift that carried the weight of a challenge. Her gaze locked onto his, daring him to believe his own lie. "Does it?" she asked, her voice soft yet sharp enough to pierce the room's heavy air. "Because it doesn't feel like an ending to me. It feels like the opening act." Ryan stepped closer, his hands slamming down on the table's cold surface as he loomed over her. "You don't get it, do you? I don't lose, not to you, not to anyone." His words were a growl, a futile attempt to reclaim dominance. But Maya's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile, a blade hidden in silk. "You already lost," she said, her voice a whisper that cut deeper than any shout. "You just haven't figured it out yet." His eyes darkened, a storm brewing behind them. "You think you scare me? I've handled people like you before, loud, cocky, always stirring up trouble." She rose slowly, pushing her chair back with a deliberate grace that made the room feel smaller, tighter. "And I've dealt with men like you," she countered, her tone steady and unyielding. "Men who think a badge makes them untouchable, who twist justice into a tool for their own egos. But power like that, it's fragile, and when it breaks, the consequences don't just ruin you, they bury you. Ryan's breath hitched, a tremor of uncertainty rippling through him, but he masked it with a sneer. The lesson was clear, though he refused to see it. Justice wasn't his to wield like a club, and the abuse of power carried a price he couldn't yet fathom. For Maya, this was more than a standoff, it was a reckoning. She wasn't finished, not by miles. When the truth clawed its way to the surface, it wouldn't just topple his career. It would shatter the illusion he'd built, exposing the rot beneath. For now, she let him simmer in his ignorance. The real fight still gathering strength in the shadows. The flickering light above buzzed faintly, a heartbeat ticking down to the moment when justice would claim its due. Ryan stood rigid, his fists balled so tightly that his knuckles gleamed a ghostly white under the flickering, fluorescent light of the cramped interrogation room. The air was thick with tension, a palpable heaviness that clung to every breath he took. His chest heaved as he fought to keep his composure, his mind racing with the gnawing realization that he was losing control. Something he'd spent years convincing himself he'd never relinquish. "Careful," he growled, his voice low and jagged like a blade scraping against stone. "You're treading on dangerous ground, Maya." His warning hung in the air, sharp and menacing, but beneath it lurked a tremor of doubt he couldn't quite bury. Maya didn't hesitate. She took a deliberate step forward, closing the space between them until she could feel the heat radiating off his tense frame. Her dark eyes burned with a quiet fury, unwavering even as his shadow loomed over her. "You crossed that line a long time ago," she said, her voice steady, each word dripping with the weight of truth. "The second you laid your hands on me, you erased any boundary you thought you could hide behind." Her tone wasn't loud, but it cut deeper than any shout, piercing through the fragile armor of his bravado. She could see the way his breath caught in his throat, the brief flicker of panic in his eyes before he masked it with a quick, forced exhale. "You resisted," Ryan snapped, the words tumbling out in a rush, as if saying them fast enough could rewrite the story etched into the bruises on her wrists. "You didn't follow my orders. That's what this is about." He leaned into the lie, his voice rising slightly, desperate to convince himself as much as her. "No one's going to see it any differently." His hands twitched at his sides, itching to reclaim the authority he felt slipping through his fingers like sand. Maya didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her posture unyielding, her gaze locked on his. "That's where you're wrong," she replied, her words slow and deliberate, each one landing like a stone in still water. "They've already seen all of it. Every angle, every word you barked, every move you made when you thought no one was watching. And it's not just you they're seeing, Ryan. It's everyone like you, every coward who hides their fear behind a badge, every bully who thinks power gives them a free pass." Her voice grew quieter, but its intensity swelled, filling the room with an unshakable certainty. Ryan stumbled back a step, as if her words had physically pushed him. His chest tightened, his breath coming in shallow bursts. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice cracked, betraying the bravado he clung to. Sweat beaded on his forehead, glistening under the harsh light, and his eyes darted toward the door, searching for an escape that wasn't there. He wanted to believe she was lying, that this was some elaborate game he could still win. But deep down, a cold, creeping dread whispered that he was wrong. Maya's stare didn't waver. "Try me," she challenged, her tone daring him to call her bluff, knowing full well he couldn't. Before he could muster a response, the door groaned open, its rusty hinges squeaking in protest. Another officer stepped inside, his broad frame filling the doorway. His name was Officer Harris, a man Maya vaguely recognized from the precinct, a quiet, unassuming figure who always seemed to linger on the edges of conflict. Today, though, his face was taut with unease, his jaw clenched as he avoided her gaze. In one hand, he clutched a thin folder, in the other, a sealed envelope. Without a word, he crossed the room and thrust both items into Ryan's hands, his movements stiff and mechanical. His eyes flicked toward Maya for a fleeting second long, enough for her to catch the flicker of guilt there before he retreated, shutting the door behind him with a soft thud. Ryan's fingers trembled as he fumbled with the folder, his breath hitching audibly. He tore it open and began flipping through the pages, his movements frantic at first. as if speed could outrun the truth. But as his eyes scanned the documents, complaints, witness statements, detailed reports of excessive force, his pace slowed. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly shade of gray. His lips parted, but no sound came out at first. Then, in a shaky stammer, he muttered, This is nonsense." He slammed the folder shut with a force that echoed through the room, the sound sharp and hollow. "None of this will stick. It's nothing." Maya leaned in closer, her voice cutting through the silence like a razor. "It doesn't have to stick, Ryan. It just has to be seen. And it already has been." Her words were calm, deliberate, but they carried the weight of a judge's gavel. She watched as his shoulders squared, his face flushing a deep, angry red. He was unraveling, and she could feel the shift in the earth moment when his carefully constructed world began to fracture. "You set me up," he shouted, his voice breaking with desperation. He lunged forward slightly, his fists clenching again as if he might strike out. This was all a setup, wasn't it? His accusation was wild, frantic, the last gasp of a man clinging to denial. Maya tilted her head, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. "No," she said softly, her voice laced with a cold, unyielding truth. "This was a reckoning, and you brought it on yourself." She let the words hang there, heavy and final, watching as they sank into him like a stone into deep water. Ryan's fists crashed against the table, the impact rattling the metal frame. "You don't get to do this to me," he roared, his voice raw with panic and rage. "You don't have the authority." His eyes were wide, wild, searching her face for some sign of weakness, some crack he could exploit. But Maya's gaze remained steady, unshaken. "I don't need authority to show people who you really are," she said. "You've done that all on your own." Her words were quiet, but they carried a power that dwarfed his bluster, stripping away the last of his defenses. His breathing grew ragged, his chest rising and falling in quick, uneven bursts as panic clawed its way up his throat. "You think this is over?" he spat, his voice trembling. "You think you can just walk out of here and ruin me?" He leaned toward her, his desperation palpable, his hands shaking at his sides. Maya stepped closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper, intimate and chilling. "I'm not ruining you, Ryan. I'm revealing you." The words were soft, but they struck like a thunderclap, reverberating in the silence that followed. Before he could respond, the door swung open again, this time with a force that made the hinges groan. A woman stepped inside, her presence commanding the room without effort. She wore a dark suit, her posture rigid, her expression a mask of cool detachment. Her name was Eleanor Grayson, a figure Maya had only heard whispers about, a no-nonsense investigator known for cutting through corruption like a scalpel through flesh. She glanced at Maya briefly, her sharp eyes assessing, before turning to Ryan. In her hand, she held the sealed envelope Harris had delivered. "Officer Daniels," she said, her voice clipped and professional as she extended it toward him. Ryan hesitated, his trembling hands hovering over the envelope as if it might burn him. Finally, he snatched it from her, ripping it open with a ferocity that betrayed his fear. His eyes darted across the pages inside the official documents, a formal notice of suspension, and something worse, something that made his knees buckle slightly before he caught himself. His face went pale, the last vestiges of color leaching away as the reality of his situation crashed down around him. Maya watched in silence, her breath steady, but her chest tight with a mix of triumph and exhaustion. She didn't need to say anything. The weight of his own actions was suffocating him now, pressing down on him until he could barely stand. He looked up at her, his voice barely a whisper, cracked and broken. "You can't do this." Her eyes were sharp, unflinching. "It's already done," she said, her tone final, unyielding. Eleanor gestured toward the door, her movements precise. "Officer Daniels, you need to come with me." Her voice was calm, but it carried an authority that left no room for argument. Ryan didn't move at first. "No," he said, shaking his head as if he could will the moment away. "No, this isn't happening." His denial was feeble, a child's plea against an inevitable tide. "It is," Maya said, her voice steady and resolute. "And it's only the beginning." She watched as his knees trembled, his body swaying slightly before he forced himself upright, clinging to the last scraps of his dignity. He turned to her one final time, his eyes blazing with a mix of fury and desperation. "You'll regret this," he hissed, his voice shaking. Maya didn't blink. "No," she said simply, "you will." Eleanor took his arm, guiding him toward the door with a firm but measured grip. As they stepped into the hallway, the door closed behind them with a hollow thud that echoed through the room. Maya stood alone, her breath escaping in a slow, deliberate exhale. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, but the tide had turned. Ryan Daniels, the man who had thrived on fear and control, was finally sinking beneath the weight of his own consequences. Through the narrow window of the interrogation room door, she watched his retreating figure. His shoulders were hunched, his hands trembling at his sides as Officer Harris flanked him, murmuring something too faint for her to hear. Ryan flinched at the words, his body stiffening, but he kept walking, each step heavier than the last. His head turned slightly, his eyes darting back toward the room, toward her, searching for some last-minute reprieve. That would never come. She could see the panic etched into every line of his face, the way his carefully built walls of arrogance and entitlement were crumbling under the crushing weight of his choices. The sight stirred something deep within her, a tangled knot of emotions she couldn't fully unravel. There was satisfaction, yes, a fierce, burning sense of justice as she watched him taste the fear and helplessness he'd forced on her. When he'd slammed her to the ground, his cuffs biting into her skin, but beneath that was something heavier, something more profound. This wasn't just about Ryan. It was about every officer who'd ever twisted their authority into a weapon, every victim told to stay quiet, to swallow their pain, to let it go. It was about a system that too often shielded the guilty and silenced the wronged. And now, finally, that system was cracking. She turned away from the window as the door clicked shut, the sound sharp and final in the stillness. The room felt suffocatingly small, the walls pressing in around her, but she stayed rooted to the spot, grounding herself with slow, steady breaths. The echo of approaching footsteps broke her reverie, and she looked up just as the door creaked open again. Eleanor Grayson stepped back inside, her expression as unreadable as before, though there was a faint tightness around her eyes that hadn't been there earlier. "He's in holding," Eleanor said, her voice clipped but carrying a quiet weight. "He's not talking yet, but it's only a matter of time." She paused, her gaze locking with Maya's, assessing her in a way that felt both clinical and deeply human. Maya crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And what happens when he does?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with a hunger for clarity. Eleanor didn't flinch. "That depends on him," she replied. "He can cooperate, maybe lessen the damage he's already done to himself, or he can dig in deeper and make it worse. But either way, this isn't stopping. The wheels are turning now, and they won't slow down." Maya exhaled slowly, the weight of those words settling over her like a mantle. "Good," she said, her voice firm, resolute. She met Eleanor's gaze, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of the stakes, of the long road still ahead, but also of the small, hard-won victory they'd claimed today. As Eleanor turned to leave, Maya lingered in the room, the silence wrapping around her like a heavy cloak. She thought of Ryan, of the terror in his eyes as he was led away, and of the countless others who might finally face the same reckoning. Justice wasn't a single moment, it was a slow, relentless tide, washing away the rot of unchecked power. And as she stood there, her breath steadying, she knew she'd helped set it in motion. The consequences of abusing authority weren't just Ryan's to bear, they were a warning to anyone who thought fear could masquerade as strength, and that, she realized, was a lesson worth fighting for. The woman's voice trembled slightly, though she tried to keep it steady, her words emerging softer than she'd planned. She paused, uncertainty flickering in her chest, before taking a tentative step closer to Maya. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked, her tone laced with concern. "After everything that unraveled today, no one would blame you for needing a moment to breathe." Her eyes searched Maya's face, hoping to find some crack in the armor, some sign that she could offer more than just words. Maya cut her off before she could finish, her voice slicing through the air, sharp and brittle, like glass about to shatter. "I don't need time," she snapped, the edge in her tone surprising even herself. She caught the sting of her own words and softened, shaking her head as if to dislodge the bitterness clinging to her. "I can't afford it," she added, quieter now, her gaze drifting to the floor. "Not while men like him are still out there, strutting around like they're above the law. Untouchable." Her fingers tightened into fists at her sides, nails digging into her palms as the weight of her frustration pressed down harder. The woman watched her in silence, her brow creasing as she absorbed Maya's words. After a moment, she nodded, her expression softening with understanding. "I get it," she said gently, "but you don't have to shoulder this all by yourself, Maya. You're not alone in this fight." Her voice carried a quiet strength, an invitation to share the burden, though she knew Maya well enough to expect resistance. Maya didn't answer. The idea of relying on someone else felt foreign, almost suffocating. She'd spent years carving out her place in a world that doubted her at every turn, building a career on the unshakable foundation of her own resilience. Depending on others wasn't just unfamiliar, it was a luxury she'd never allowed herself. As the woman turned to leave, her footsteps soft against the tiled floor, Maya's hand shot out instinctively, catching her arm. "Wait," she said, her voice unsteady for the first time. "Did anyone contact his family?" The woman stopped, turning back with a frown tugging at her lips. "Why would we?" she asked, genuine confusion coloring her tone. Maya hesitated, her mind racing as she pieced together the implications. "Because people like him don't just fade away without a fight," she said, her words deliberate. "If there's anyone out there, family, friends, someone loyal enough to cover for him, we need to know who they are and what they're planning." Her eyes burned with a mix of determination and unease, the stakes of this battle sinking deeper into her bones. The woman's gaze sharpened, a flicker of realization passing through her. "I'll dig into it," she promised, her voice firm now, resolute. She gave Maya a small, reassuring nod before stepping out, the door clicking shut behind her with a sound that seemed to echo in the stillness. Alone at last, Maya let herself collapse into a chair, her legs trembling beneath her as if they'd been holding her up through sheer willpower. Her body ached, every muscle taut from the tension she'd carried since the moment Ryan's hand had clamped around her arm earlier that day. Exhaustion clawed at her, pulling her down, but her mind refused to rest. It churned relentlessly, replaying the confrontation in vivid, unrelenting detail the way Ryan's eyes had widened when he recognized her, the flash of panic as the evidence piled up against him, the frantic edge in his voice as he scrambled to talk his way out. She could still feel the heat of his arrogance, the smug certainty that he'd never face consequences. It wasn't enough that he'd been caught, not yet. Justice demanded more. Time slipped by, minutes stretching into an eternity, until the door creaked open again. This time, it was Ryan himself who stepped inside, a shadow of the man he'd been just hours before. Stripped of his uniform, his badge and gun confiscated, he looked diminutive, broad shoulders slumping under an invisible weight, his once confident stride reduced to a shuffle. His eyes, hollowed out by defeat, avoided hers as two officers flanked him, their stern faces and rigid postures a silent testament to the freedom he'd already lost. They guided him to the chair across from her and lingered near the doorway, their presence a constant, unspoken warning. Maya straightened, her spine stiffening as she locked her gaze on him. Her expression hardened into something unyielding, a mask forged from anger and resolve. Ryan didn't look up at first. His head bowed as if the shamier, perhaps the reality, pressed too heavily on him. But when he finally met her eyes, a faint spark flared behind the emptiness, a stubborn flicker of defiance that refused to die. "This isn't over," he rasped, his voice rough and strained but steady. "You think you've won, but you haven't." Maya leaned forward, her hands pressing flat against the table, grounding herself as she stared him down. "I don't think I've won," she said, her voice low and unwavering. "I know I have." The words carried a quiet, lethal certainty, a declaration etched in stone. Ryan scoffed, a hollow sound that lacked the fire he'd once wielded so effortlessly. "You don't know what it's like," he muttered, his tone dropping as bitterness seeped in. "To have everything you've built torn away in a heartbeat. To be judged before you can even open your mouth to defend yourself." His hands twitched on the table, restless with the frustration he couldn't release. Maya's eyes darkened, a storm brewing behind them as his words struck a nerve. "You think I don't know what that feels like?" she shot back, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "You think I haven't lived that every single day, scrutinized, dismissed, underestimated? The difference is, I never had a badge to hide behind when the world came crashing down. I had to face it every time." Her words trembled with the weight of years spent fighting, a fury she rarely let surface now spilling over. Ryan flinched, a crack appearing in his bravado, though he tried to mask it with a sneer. "You're not better than me," he said, but the accusation felt flimsy, a desperate grasp at pride. Maya's voice dropped to a whisper, deliberate and cold. "No," she said, "I'm just not like you." She let the words hang between them, heavy with truth, watching as they sank in. Ryan's hands clenched into fists, but the fight was draining from him. His shoulders sagged further. His gaze darted nervously to the officers by the door. He was trapped, cornered by his own actions, and the realization was beginning to suffocate him. "You had a choice," Maya continued, her tone steady now, though anger simmered beneath it. "You could have walked away when it started. You could have owned up to what you did. But you didn't. You doubled down, and now you're the one who has to live with the wreckage." Her jaw tightened, her eyes boring into his with an intensity that made him shrink. "You're not just scared of what's happening to you," she said, reading the fear etched into his features. "You're terrified of what it means that you're not invincible after all." Ryan's mouth opened, then closed, his defiance crumbling into silence. For the first time, he looked truly afraid, not just of the consequences closing in, but of the deeper truth Maya had laid bare. She stood, her movements deliberate, her gaze never wavering from his. "This isn't about revenge," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "It's about accountability. And whether you accept it or not, you're going to answer for every choice you made." She turned to leave, her steps slow and purposeful, but paused at the door, her hand resting on the frame. "You were right about one thing," she said, her voice carrying a quiet finality without looking back. "This isn't over, not for you." With that, she stepped out, the door thudding shut behind her, leaving Ryan alone in the dim room, the weight of his unraveling life pressing down around him. The hallway stretched out before her, cold and sterile, the sound of her heels echoing off the polished floor with every determined step. Her heart pounded beneath her ribs, a relentless drumbeat that betrayed the calm she projected. She didn't glance back, she couldn't. To look back would be to falter, and she'd come too far for that. She'd won this battle, exposed Ryan Daniels for what he was, but victory felt elusive, overshadowed by a heaviness that clung to her like damp fog. The humiliation of his actions, the anger at his arrogance, the disbelief that it had taken this long, they didn't vanish with his downfall. Instead, they tightened around her chest, a reminder that justice, while served, rarely erased the scars. Officers passed her in the corridor, some stealing quick, curious glances before averting their eyes, others holding her gaze just long enough to make her feel the shifting tension in the air. Whispers followed her, faint but persistent, like the hum of a distant storm. She could sense the unease rippling through the precinct, uncomfortable truth settling in, the lines being drawn. Ryan had allies, people who'd turn a blind eye to evidence, who'd cling to loyalty over reason. The proof against him was ironclad, but Maya knew that for some, facts wouldn't outweigh the bonds they'd built. It was a bitter pill, one she'd swallowed too many times before. She reached the exit and pushed the door open, stepping into the crisp evening air. The sky was a canvas of fading orange and deepening purple, the last threads of daylight bleeding into the horizon as the city's lights flickered to life below. Her phone buzzed insistently in her pocket, but she let it go unanswered. She wasn't ready yet to face her colleagues' questions, not to reassure her family, not even to confront the tangle of emotions churning inside her. Instead, she walked, the sprawling city unfolding before her, vibrant and pulsing with energy. Yet it felt distant, as if she were peering at it through a pane of glass, separated from its rhythm by the weight of the day. Her mind drifted back in fragments, sharp and unrelenting Tingrian's face when the evidence was spread out before him, undeniable and damning, the wild panic in his eyes as his excuses crumbled, the raw, ugly anger that erupted when he realized his power couldn't save him. She stopped at a crosswalk, the red light casting a faint glow across her face as she waited, lost in thought. A part of her had expected to feel triumph, a surge of vindication, after bringing him down. But all she felt was a bone-deep weariness, a quiet ache that refused to lift. Ryan Daniels wasn't just one corrupt man, it was a symptom, a single thread in a vast, tangled web of abuse and entitlement. Toppling him was a victory, yes, but it was like pulling one brick from an endless wall, the structure still looming tall and oppressive. It was a start, a crack in the foundation, but it wasn't enough, not nearly enough. Her phone buzzed again, vibrating against her hip, and this time she let out a slow breath, her fingers brushing the edge of her pocket. The fight wasn't over, not for Ryan, not for her, and not for the countless others still caught in the shadow of that wall. Justice had been served today, but its lesson lingered. Power, when twisted and abused, left wreckage in its wake, and the road to accountability was long, winding, and far from finished. Maya's thumb hovered over the glowing screen of her phone, trembling slightly as she stared at the message that had just come through. It was from Jasmine, her words simple yet heavy with unspoken weight. Just checking in. Elijah's fine. Call me when you can. The moment Maya read her nephew's name, a sharp pang gripped her chest, squeezing tight like a fist around her heart. She could still see his small face, streaked with tears, as they'd stood together in the park just days ago. His wide, pleading eyes had locked onto hers, searching for something Zafadi, answers. A promise that she could fix the broken world around him. She hadn't been able to give him that. The memory of her own helplessness clawed at her insides, a bitter taste rising in her throat. She'd failed him in that moment, powerless against the chaos that had swallowed them both. And the fear that realization stirred in her was a living thing, gnawing at her resolve. The traffic light ahead flickered to green, bathing the dashboard in a soft emerald glow. But Maya didn't budge. Her hands stayed frozen on the wheel, her breath shallow as her mind churned. It wasn't until the faint tap of footsteps echoed behind her that she snapped out of her reverie. She turned her head just as a woman in a sleek, dark suit emerged from the shadows of the evening, her presence cutting through the hum of the city like a blade. The woman's hands were buried deep in her coat pockets, her posture casual yet deliberate, as though she'd been waiting for this moment all along. "Can't seem to stay away, can you?" Maya said, her voice steady but edged with a weariness she couldn't quite hide. There was no venom in her tone, just a tired acknowledgement of the dance they'd been locked in for far too long. The woman paused beside her, her sharp eyes glinting under the streetlights. "Neither can you," she replied, her voice low and measured, carrying a hint of something unspoken, respect, perhaps, or a shared burden neither of them could shake. Maya's lips twitched into a smirk, but it was fleeting, dissolving as quickly as it had come. "What now?" she asked, her words hanging heavy in the cool air. The woman hesitated, her gaze drifting to the bustling street for a moment before returning to Maya. "Daniels is talking," she said finally, each syllable dropping like a stone into still water. "He's trying to cut a deal. He's naming names." Maya's stomach lurched, a cold wave of dread washing over her. She'd anticipated the shot, even banked on it. In her quieter moments of strategy, but hearing it spoken aloud turned the abstract into something painfully real. Her pulse hammered in her ears, a frantic rhythm she couldn't quiet. "Names?" she pressed, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman nodded, her expression tightening. "Other officers, people higher up. He's not going down alone, and he knows it." Maya crossed her arms over her chest, her fingers digging into her sleeves as her mind raced ahead, piecing together the implications. Daniels wasn't just a rogue cop. He was a thread in a much larger tapestry, one she'd only begun to unravel. "And what about the people protecting him?" she asked, her tone sharpening. "The ones who let him get away with this for years." The woman exhaled, her breath curling into the crisp night air like smoke. "That's where it gets complicated," she admitted, her voice softening with something that might have been regret. Maya's jaw clenched, a flicker of frustration sparking in her chest. "It's always complicated," she muttered, her eyes narrowing as she studied the woman's face. She saw the faint lines of exhaustion etched there, the subtle tension in her shoulders, a mirror to her own weariness, perhaps, but tempered by a quiet resolve. The woman held her gaze for a long moment, then spoke again, her words careful but firm. You did the right thing, you know. No matter how this plays out, you did the right thing. Maya looked away, her eyes sweeping over the chaotic blur of the streetcars weaving through traffic, their horns blaring in sharp bursts, people laughing as they spilled out of a nearby bar, the rhythmic clatter of footsteps against the pavement. Did I? She said, her voice raw with doubt. Because right now, it feels like all I did was kick over a hornet's nest. You did more than that, the woman countered, her tone steady and unwavering. You set it on fire. A ghost of a smile tugged at Maya's lips, but it never reached her eyes. Lost somewhere in the storm of emotions swirling within her, she turned back to the woman, her expression hardening. What happens next? The woman's face grew stern, her features sharpening with a resolve that matched Maya's own. That depends on what Daniel says. But either way, this isn't over, not for him, not for you, and definitely not for the people who've been covering for him. Maya nodded, her shoulders squaring as she straightened, a quiet fire igniting in her chest. Good, she said, her voice low but resolute. Let it keep going. Let it spread. The woman hesitated again, her hand hovering near her coat pocket before she reached inside and pulled out a slim folder. She held it out, her fingers steady despite the weight of what she was offering. You might want to see this, she said, her voice tinged with caution. Maya took it, her fingertips brushing against the smooth paper as a shiver ran through her. What is it? She asked, her throat tightening. His personnel file, the woman replied, the unedited version. Maya's stomach plummeted as she opened the folder, her hands trembling slightly with the effort to keep them steady. She flipped through the pages, each one a revelation more damning than the last. Complaints filed and buried, internal investigations that had vanished into thin air, testimonies from voices silenced by fear or force. It wasn't just Ryan Daniels. It was the entire system that had cradled him, shielding him from the consequences of his actions. Her grip tightened around the folder, the edges crumpling under her fingers as the truth settled over her like a suffocating fog. This isn't just about him, she said quietly, her voice trembling with a mix of fury and determination. The woman nodded, her eyes dark with understanding. No, it's not. Maya looked up, her gaze hard and unyielding. Then let's make sure everyone knows it. The woman didn't argue. Instead, she turned and melted back into the shadows, her footsteps fading into the city's relentless pulse. Maya stood alone at the edge of the sidewalk, the folder clutched tightly in her hands, its contents a ticking bomb she could no longer ignore. Around her, the world churned, on cars honking, voices rising in laughter. The sharp clack of heels against concrete, but it all felt distant, muted against the roar of her own thoughts. Her focus sharpened, the pieces of this sprawling puzzle clicking into place with ruthless clarity. Ryan Daniels was just the beginning, a single crack in a wall she'd only started to dismantle. The corruption ran deeper than she'd ever imagined, a network of complicity woven through the ranks, protecting its own at the expense of the innocent. But that didn't scare her. If anything, it fueled here a slow, burning ember that flared brighter with every name she'd read, every injustice she'd uncovered. She'd spent her life proving people wrong, defying the limits others tried to impose on her. And she wasn't about to stop now. This fight wasn't just for her anymore. It was for Elijah, whose tear-streaked face still haunted her dreams, for Jasmine, whose quiet strength held their family together, for every soul who'd been told to swallow their pain and stay silent. She wasn't backing down, not until the whole rotten system came crashing down, dragging Daniels and every coward who'd enabled him into the light. Her fingers shook as she closed the folder, the weight of its secrets pressing against her chest like a vice. This wasn't just about one man's crimes anymore. It was about every signature on those reports, every name that had turned a blind eye, every cog in the machine that had let this fester unchecked for years. Her breath slowed, steadying as the realization took root. She wasn't facing a single enemy, but a sprawling web of corruption so entrenched that exposing it would rattle the very foundations of the world she knew. And that was exactly what she intended to do. The sharp click of heels against the pavement broke through her spiraling thoughts, pulling her back to the present. She looked up to see the woman in the dark suit returning, her stride purposeful but her eyes shadowed with a flicker of unease perhaps. the first crack in her otherwise unshakable facade. Maya met her gaze, her voice steady despite the tempest raging inside her. "What else did he give you?" The woman hesitated, a fleeting pause that spoke volumes. Before reaching into her coat and pulling out another envelope, she handed it over, her fingers brushing against Maya's with a faint tremor. "Enough to make them nervous," she said, her tone clipped. "More names, more connections, more questions about who's protecting who." Maya's grip tightened around the envelope as she tore it open, her eyes scanning the list with a growing sense of dread and resolve. Some names she knew, officers she'd worked alongside, their faces flashing through her memory with a bitter sting. Supervisors she'd once admired, now tainted by their silence. Politicians who'd smiled for the cameras while propping up a rotting system. Others were strangers, but the patterns were unmistakable. This wasn't random. It was deliberate, orchestrated, a carefully guarded secret now spilling into the open. She exhaled slowly, her breath steadying as she looked up at the woman. "This doesn't stop here," she said, her voice quiet but laced with steel. The woman nodded, her own voice softening, almost a whisper. "It won't. But you need to be careful. You're making enemies with people who don't lose quietly." Maya's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes blazing with a defiance that had carried her this far. "Let them come," she said, her words a vow as much as a challenge. She wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. Ash was tearing down a legacy of abuse, brick by brick, and she'd keep going until the truth stood bare for all to see. The lesson was clear: power unchecked bred monsters, and the consequences of that corruption would ripple far beyond Daniels, shaking the guilty awake in their beds. For Maya, there was no turning back, only forward, into the fire she'd ignited. The air in the hallway felt thick, heavy with unspoken words and the lingering echoes of tension that refused to dissipate. Maya stood there, her gaze unwavering, her dark eyes piercing through the dim light as they locked onto the woman before her. She wasn't one to back down, ever had been, and the fire in her chest burned hotter now than ever before. She could feel it, the steady rhythm of her own resolve, pulsing beneath her skin like a drumbeat she'd learned to trust over years of fighting battles no one else dared to touch. The woman opened her mouth to reply, her lips parting with the faintest tremble. But before a single syllable could escape, the heavy groan of a door swinging open shattered the moment. At the far end of the corridor, Ryan Daniels emerged, his silhouette framed by the flickering fluorescent lights overhead. Flanked by two officers, their boots scuffing against the worn linoleum, he stepped into view. He wasn't in a jumpsuit yet, just his plain clothes, rumpled and clinging to him like a second skin he hadn't shed in days. His shoulders slumped forward, as though the weight of his own choices had finally settled there, pressing him down. His face was pale, almost ghostly under the harsh lighting, but his iced toe sharp, defiant. I still carried a spark that refused to die. The moment he spotted Maya, that spark flared, a volatile mix of resentment and desperation igniting behind his stare. He didn't just look at her. He glared, his gaze boring into hers like he could will her to crumble. But Maya didn't flinch. She met his stare head-on, her expression carved from stone, unyielding and fierce. She wanted him to feel the crushing gravity of his actions, the consequences tightening around him like a noose he'd tied himself. She could almost see it in his eyes, the realization creeping in, the walls closing tighter with every step he took. Ryan's pace slowed as he drew closer, his sneakers dragging against the floor, each scuff a reluctant surrender to the inevitable. His voice sliced through the stifling air, low and jagged, sharp enough to draw blood if words could wound. "This isn't over," he hissed, his breath fogging faintly against the cold space between them. Maya's face remained a mask of calm, but when she spoke, her voice rang out with a force that made the air tremble. "Yes, it is." The words landed like a hammer, solid and final, and for a fleeting half-second, Ryan froze, his jaw clenched, the muscles twitching under his skin as if he were biting back a retort he didn't have the strength to voice. The officers at his sides shifted, their hands brushing his arms, nudging him forward with a quiet insistence. He stumbled slightly, then straightened, disappearing down the hall as the shadows swallowed him whole. Maya turned back to the woman, her breathing steady now, though her heart still thundered in her chest. "How long before the rest of them know?" she asked, her tone softer but laced with an unshakable certainty. The woman's lips pressed into a thin, taut line, her eyes darting to the side as if searching for an answer she didn't want to give. "They already do," she admitted, her voice tight with frustration, words spreading faster than we can contain it. "Some will run, others will dig in and fight. A few are already scrambling to cut deals, clawing at whatever is left to save themselves." Maya nodded, her mind spinning like a storm gathering strength. She could picture chaos unfolding beyond these walls, the dominoes falling one by one as the truth clawed its way into the light. "Then let them fight," she said, her words steady, almost daring the universe to test her resolve. The woman hesitated, her brows knitting together as doubt flickered across her face. "And if they come after you?" she pressed, her voice dropping to a whisper, as though speaking the possibility aloud might summon it into being. Maya's gaze hardened, her eyes glinting like polished steel. "Let them try." The words hung there, heavy and defiant, a promise wrapped in a challenge. She turned on her heel and started the long walk back to her office, the city's hum seeping through the walls, a distant chorus of horns, sirens, and voices that buzzed around her but never quite touched her. Each step echoed in the empty corridor, her boots striking the floor with a rhythm that matched the steady beat of her determination. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a sharp vibration that jolted her from her thoughts. She ignored it at first, letting it hum against her thigh as she pushed forward. But when it buzzed again, insistent and unrelenting, she sighed and pulled it out. Jasmine's voice spilled through the speaker the moment she answered, tight with worry and trembling slightly at the edges. "Are you okay?" The question was raw, urgent, cutting through the static of the call. Maya leaned against the edge of her desk, the cool wood pressing into her hip as she pinched the bridge of her nose, trying to ease the ache building behind her eyes. "I will be," she said, forcing her voice to stay even, though it wavered just enough to betray the exhaustion creeping in. "How's Elijah?" Jasmine's tone softened, a gentle shift that carried the warmth of relief. "He's okay now, but he was terrified, kept asking if they were going to take you away again. He wouldn't let go of me until I promised him you'd come home." Maya's chest tightened, a sharp pang slicing through her as she pictured her son, his small hands clutching Jasmine's sleeve, his wide eyes searching for answers she couldn't give him yet. She swallowed hard, steadying herself. "Tell him I'm fine," she said, her voice firm but tender. "And tell him I'm proud of how brave he was." Jasmine paused, the silence stretching long enough to feel heavy. "Maya, what's really going on?" she asked finally, her words cautious, probing. Maya exhaled slowly, the breath slipping out like a confession she wasn't ready to make. "It's complicated," she said, "but it's almost over." Jasmine didn't buy it. Maya could hear it in the way her friend's silence lingered, thick with skepticism. "I know you," Jasmine said at last, her voice low and knowing. "It's never just almost over with you." A faint smile tugged at Maya's lips, a flicker of warmth breaking through the storm inside her. "Not this time," she replied, though even she wasn't sure she believed it. Jasmine let the quiet settle again, then added softly, "Just be careful. You're not the only one with something to lose." The call ended with a click, and Maya sank into her chair, the leather creaking under her weight. Her fingers brushed the edges of the folder on her desk, its corners worn from too many hands, too many late nights. Jasmine's words echoed in her mind, sinking deep into the cracks of her resolve. This wasn't just about Harriet, never had been. It was about Elijah, his quiet courage and the future she was fighting to protect for him. It was about Jasmine, who'd stood by her through every storm, her loyalty a lifeline Maya clung to when the waves got too high. And it was about everyone else out there, watching, waiting to see if someone like her, a woman who'd been battered by the system, could face down someone like Ryan and come out standing. Winning wasn't enough anymore. This was about justice, about tearing down the shields that men like Ryan hid behind, ensuring no one else would suffer under their weight. A sharp knock jolted her from her thoughts. The door creaked open, and the woman in the dark suit stepped inside, her face etched with urgency. Her heels clicked against the floor, a staccato rhythm that matched the quickening pulse in Maya's veins. "We've got a problem," the woman said, her voice clipped, her eyes darting to meet Maya's. Maya straightened, her spine stiffening as she braced herself. "What kind of problem?" The woman hesitated, her fingers twisting together briefly before she spoke. "Daniels is threatening to go public. Not just about the other, she's got dirt on you, too. He's spinning it into a smear campaign, trying to drag you down before the trial even starts." Maya's stomach lurched, a cold knot tightening in her core, but her voice didn't waver. "Then we hit back harder," she said, her tone steel-clad, unyielding. The woman's brows lifted, doubt flashing in her eyes. "Are you sure? He's desperate, Maya. People like him, they do reckless things when they've got nothing left to lose." Maya rose to her feet, her gaze steady, unflinching. "So do people like me." She followed the woman back into the hallway, her steps deliberate, each one a declaration of intent. Her pulse raced, a wild drumbeat beneath her ribs, but her face remained a fortress calm, resolute, unbreakable. The tension in the air thickened as they neared the holding cell. Through the glass, Maya caught sight of Ryan pacing like a caged animal, his hands raking through his hair, tugging at the strands as he barked at the officer stationed outside. He looked smaller now, diminishedless like the towering figure who'd once pinned her to the ground with a sneer, more like a man unraveling under the weight of his own collapse. The badge was gone, the authority he'd wielded like a weapon stripped away, leaving nothing but a hollow shell scrambling to hold onto something anything might save him. He turned abruptly, his eyes locking onto hers through the glass, and for a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them. Anger and fear warred in his gaze, twin flames flickering behind the desperation. Maya didn't blink. She stepped closer, her breath fogging faintly against the cold pain, and let him harrily see her, not the woman he'd tried to break, but the one who'd risen from the ashes he'd left behind. Ryan stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping as he leaned against the wall, his fingers twitching restlessly. He looked like a man who'd lost everything because he had. The power, the control, the shield he'd used to justify every cruel act had all slipped through his grasp, leaving him exposed, vulnerable, human. His voice crackled through the small speaker in the wall, low and rough, edged with a bitterness that couldn't mask his defeat. "I hope you're proud of yourself." Maya tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable, letting the silence stretch until it pressed against him like a physical weight. "Proud of what?" she asked, her tone calm but cutting, daring him to say it. Ryan's eyes flickered, a spark of defiance flaring briefly before it dimmed. "Of tearing me down, of ruining my life." His words were brittle, cracking under the strain of his own denial. Maya let the silence linger again, watching the desperation seep deeper into his features. Then she stepped closer, her voice steady, deliberate, each word a brick in the wall she was building between his past and her future. "You ruined your own life, Ryan. All I did was hold up a mirror so everyone else could see it. You think I'm the reason you're in there? This started long before my back, when you decided power was yours to abuse. When you looked at someone and saw a target instead of a person. That badge didn't make you untouchable. It just hid the mess you were making until someone finally called it out." His mouth twitched, a protest forming and dying on his lips as she pressed on. "You built this cage, Ryan. Every choice, every time you crossed a line and told yourself it was just a feed you locked yourself in. I'm just the one who turned the key." She stepped back, her gaze never leaving his, and for the first time, she felt the shift balance tipping, the control sliding into her hands. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but as she stood there, staring down the man who'd once loomed so large, Maya knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't let it slip away. Not now, not ever. Justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about stripping away the illusions that let men like Ryan thrive. And as the cracks in the system widened, exposing the rot beneath, Maya understood the lesson etched into every moment of this fight. Power, when wielded without accountability, crumbled under its own weight. Ryan's fall wasn't just his reckoning, it was a warning to anyone who thought they could stand above the consequences forever. Ryan edged forward, his voice slicing through the air like a blade honed by years of frustration. "Don't act like you've got me all figured out," he snapped, his tone brittle with defiance. Maya tilted her head ever so slightly, her gaze unwavering, a quiet storm brewing behind her dark eyes. "I don't need to know everything about you, Ryan," she replied, her voice calm but carrying the weight of someone who'd stared down too many shadows to flinch now. I've seen fear dressed up as power more times than I care to remember. I've felt its cold grip on the other side, stood there while it tried to choke the life out of me. I know it better than you think. Her words landed like stones in still water, rippling through the tension between them. Ryan's breath caught in his throat, a sharp, jagged sound that betrayed him. For the first time, Maya saw something fracture in the hard shell he'd built around himself. Doubt, raw and uninvited, flickered across his face. He swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a low, bitter murmur. You think this makes you better than me, don't you? The question hung there, laced with the desperation of a man clinging to the last frayed threads of his control. Maya's expression didn't shift, her features carved from resolve. No, she said simply, her tone steady as granite. It makes me better than the version of me you tried to pin down. The words struck him like a physical blow, and Ryan flinched, his hands curling into tight fists at his sides. His knuckles whitened, but he didn't retreat. He stood rooted to the spot, shoulders taut, chest rising and falling with shallow, uneven breaths. Then, as if the confession had clawed its way out against his will, he muttered, I didn't mean for it to spiral like this. The admission tumbled out fast, reckless, like he'd tried to hold it back but couldn't. Maya's eyebrows arched slightly, a faint crack in her composed facade, but she held her silence, letting him unravel. Ryan turned his head away, his jaw clenching as he wrestled with the storm raging inside him. I wasn't thinking straight, he continued, his voice trembling with the effort to keep it steady. I saw you standing there, so damn sure of yourself, like the world could throw anything at you and you just shrug it off, like you didn't give a damn what anyone thought, didn't need anyone to tell you you were enough. And it burned me up inside. He dragged his hands through his hair, fingers tangling in the mess as frustration poured out of him like water breaching a dam. It wasn't even about you, Maya. It was me standing there, feeling every pair of eyes on me, waiting for me to prove I was somebody. Maya's eyes narrowed, a spark of recognition igniting behind them, but Ryan pressed on, his voice growing ragged. I had to show them I was in control, that I wasn't just another badge they'd nod at and then laugh about behind my back. I needed them to see I mattered, that I wasn't weak. His anger ebbed, giving way to something softer, more vulnerable, heavy and suffocating, settled into the lines of his face. For a fleeting moment, Maya's breath hitched, a pang of something pity, maybe tightening her chest, but she forced it down, keeping her voice even. Prove what, Ryan? She asked, cutting through the haze of his confession like a blade. He met her gaze again, and the fire in his eyes had dulled to embers. That I was the one calling the shots, he said quietly. That I wasn't invisible. Maya exhaled, a slow, deliberate breath, and then her words came, sharp and unyielding. So that's what this was. You flexing your authority to impress people who weren't even watching. Ryan's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him like blood from a wound. I don't expect you to get it, he muttered, barely audible. Oh, I get it, Maya shot back, her voice rising with a sudden edge. I know exactly what it's like to walk into a room and feel every judgment already locked in place, before you've even opened your mouth. I've lived that way, Ryan. But here's where we split. You don't lash out at the people who don't deserve it just to feel big. Ryan shook his head, but it wasn't defiance this time. It was surrender, a slow collapse of the man he'd convinced himself he was. You think I enjoyed being that guy? He asked, his voice cracking. You think I wanted to be the one who scared some kid so bad he cried right there on the playground? With everyone staring, his eyes darted away, unable to hold hers. And Maya caught the glint of something new, regret, fragile and unguarded. Her tone softened, but only just, a thread of steel still woven through it. It's not about what you wanted, Ryan. It's about what you did. He didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the floor, and for the first time, Maya saw the weight of his choices settle over him like a shroud. I don't know how to undo this, he whispered, more to himself than to her, his voice so faint it barely reached her. Maya stepped closer to the glass partition between them, her reflection blurring into his. You can't undo it, she said, her words heavy with a truth neither of them could escape. Not all of it, but you can own it. That's what terrifies you most, isn't it? Their eyes locked, and for a suspended heartbeat, The room held its breath. The door creaked open behind her, and a woman in a crisp, dark suit stepped inside. Her face tight with urgency. "We need to talk," she said. Her voice clipped. Maya didn't break eye contact with Ryan. "Give me a minute," she replied, firm but calm. The woman hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line, then nodded and slipped back out. The door clicking shut behind her. Maya leaned in, her voice dropping to a near whisper, laced with quiet intensity. "This isn't just about you, Ryan. It never was. But if you want to keep this from burying Youan, everyone else caught up in it, you've got to start telling the truth." His voice broke, a jagged edge cutting through the stillness. "And if I do?" Maya's expression hardened, unyielding. "Then you face what comes next. But at least you'll stop running." Ryan didn't answer. Instead, he sank onto the bench behind him, his head dropping into his hands, fingers digging into his scalp as the enormity of it all pressed down on him. Maya turned and walked out, her heart hammering against her ribs, though her steps remained steady, deliberate. She didn't glance back, she couldn't, not with the fight still ahead of her. The woman in the suit waited just beyond the door, her posture rigid, her face a mask of guarded neutrality. "He's starting to break," she said, her tone flat but her eyes sharp, searching Maya's for a reaction. Maya nodded, her voice quieter now but no less resolute. "Let him." The hallway stretched out before her, its sterile fluorescent lights casting long, harsh shadows on the tiled floor. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of the Kasiyaf, everything it stood for, bearing down on her shoulders. It wasn't just Ryan Daniels anymore. It was the whole rotten system that had propped him up, every crack in the foundation people had turned a blind eye to, because fixing it meant tearing it all apart. She reached the end of the corridor and pushed through the double doors, stepping into the cool night air. The city pulsed around her, car horns blaring, distant voices rising and falling. The chaotic heartbeat of a place that never slept. For the first time in days, Maya let herself take a deep, shuddering breath. This wasn't the end, not even close, but the fractures were widening, and she wasn't about to stop until the entire structure crumbled. Hours later, Maya sat alone in her office, the clamor of the courthouse long faded into memory. The echoes of reporters' shouted questions lingered faintly in her mind, but the silence of the room was thicker, more oppressive. Her fingers brushed lightly against the open file on her desk, its pages spilling out like the guts of a beast she'd finally gutted. Names stared back at hair officers, supervisors, bureaucrats, one tied to a signature, a complaint, a moment of cowardice hidden behind policy and procedure. They'd surfaced only because Ryan Daniels had cracked, his confession spilling out in a frantic bid to save himself. But salvation wasn't in the cards for him, not after what he'd done. Not after what she'd uncovered. His words had ignited a firestorm. Investigations erupted like wildfires, sweeping through the department, dragging men and women from their cushy offices into stark interrogation rooms. Desks were cleared out under the cover of night, resignations piling up before the ink on the summonses dried. Some fought back, hurling accusations of conspiracy and corruption. But the evidence Maya had painstakingly stitched together was a noose they couldn't slip. She'd spent countless hours hunched over records, piecing together the puzzle no one else had dared touch. And when it all came into focus, it wasn't just Ryan at the center, it was a sprawling web. A culture built to shield itself no matter who got crushed beneath it. Ryan's sentencing loomed on the horizon, a reckoning for a man who'd wielded power like a club, oblivious to the lives he'd shattered. But Maya knew it was bigger than him. Every name in that file, every signature on a buried report, was a lesson etched in blood and tears. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed from on high, it was a battle, hard-won and relentless. And the consequences of abusing power, they didn't just destroy the abuser, they rippled out, poisoning everything they touched, until someone like her stood up to break the cycle. She leaned back in her chair, the city's restless hum filtering through the window, and steeled herself for the fight still to come. The wall was cracking, and she'd be damned if she didn't see it fall. The courtroom was suffocating, the air heavy with the weight of shattered illusions. As Ben Swift sat slumped in the defendant's chair, once a figure of authority, he was now reduced to a husk, his badge stripped away, his pension gone, his name tarnished beyond repair. His hands fidgeted in his lap, fingers tracing invisible patterns, as if searching for the power he'd once wielded so carelessly. He didn't dare lift his head at first, not until the judge's gavel fell like a thunderclap, sealing his fate. The plea deal he'd taken thinking it might spare him was a flimsy shield against the storm he'd unleashed. As the sentence echoed through the room, his eyes flickered up, catching Maya's gaze from the back. She stood motionless, her face a mask of steel, unreadable yet piercing. No tears, no triumph, just a quiet, unshakable resolve. For a fleeting moment, their eyes locked, and Ben saw something he hadn't expected. Not the fiery anger that had once fueled her, nor the defiance he'd tried to crush, but a hollow resignation mirrored in his own chest. He'd lost everything, and the weight of that truth pressed down harder than the cuffs now biting into his wrists. As the bailiff led him away, his footsteps dragging across the polished floor, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been the architect of his own ruin. Outside, the world erupted into chaos. The courthouse steps swarmed with reporters, their microphones thrusting toward Maya like spears. Camera flashes slicing through the late afternoon haze. Voices clashed in a frantic cacophony, each one clawing for a piece of her story. She stood tall amidst the frenzy, her dark coat billowing slightly in the wind, her chin lifted as if daring the crowd to push her off balance. Her voice cut through the noise, steady and deliberate, devoid of the tremor that might have betrayed the exhaustion gnawing at her bones. "This isn't just about Ryan Daniels," she said, her words measured but sharp enough to draw blood. "It's about holding people accountable, about dismantling a cycle of corruption that's festered unchecked for years." She paused, letting the weight of her statement settle, her breath visible in the crisp air. "One arrest doesn't end it. This is bigger than him, bigger than me. Change doesn't come quick or easy, but it starts when people refuse to look the other way." The reporters scribbled furiously, their pens racing to capture every syllable. But Maya's gaze drifted past them, fixed on some distant point where justice and consequence blurred into one. She turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the stone, leaving the clamor behind. That night, her words ricocheted across news broadcasts, dissected by sharp-tongued analysts and lauded by activists who saw her as a beacon. But Maya didn't tune in. She didn't need the validation of strangers' voice lived every brutal second of this fight. Back in her office, the dim light cast long shadows across the cluttered desk, the folder still sitting there, its edges worn from restless hands. She sank into her chair, the leather creaking under her weight, and let out a slow, shuddering exhale. For the first time in weeks, the burden felt lighter, not gone, but bearable. Her phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a text from Jasmine. "Elijah's fine. He's asleep now. Call when you can." Relief washed over her, soft and warm, loosening the knot in her chest. She hadn't realized how tightly she'd been holding her breath, how every muscle had been braced for the next blow. Elijah, her nephew, her anchor, was safe. His small, trusting face flashed in her mind, and she felt a pang of something fierce and protective. He was why she couldn't crumble, why she'd clawed her way through this nightmare even when the walls seemed to close in, suffocating her with doubt and fear. Later, under a sky bruised with twilight, Maya found herself at the playground where it had all begun. The swings hung still, their chains glinting faintly under the streetlights. The park deserted save for the ghosts of that day. She could still hear the cows, the shouts, the scuffle, the sharp gasp of Elijah as he watched, wide-eyed, while Ryan's knee pinned her to the ground. The memory clawed at her, vivid and raw, the grit of dirt against her cheek, the sting of humiliation, the helpless rage boiling in her veins as she fought to shield Elijah from the ugliness unfolding before him. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms, and for a moment, that old anger flared hot and wild. But this time, it didn't swallow her whole. This time, it felt like a fading echo, a storm she'd already weathered. She'd faced the beast, stared into its eyes, and come out the other side unscathed, but unbroken. A car engine rumbled nearby, pulling her from the reverie. Headlights swept across the grass as Jasmine's beat-up sedan rolled to a stop. The door creaked open, and Jasmine stepped out, her silhouette softened by the dim glow. Elijah trailed behind, his sneakers scuffing the pavement, his small frame hunched with hesitation. Then he saw Maya, and something shifted as uncertainty melted away, and he ran to her, his arms flinging around her waist as she knelt to meet him. "Are you okay?" he whispered, his voice fragile, barely audible over the rustle of leaves. Maya's heart twisted, but she managed to smile, brushing his unruly curls back with a tenderness that belied the steel in her spine. "I'm better than okay," she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. Jasmine approached, her usual sharpness dulled by a quiet warmth. "Ready?" she asked, her eyes searching Maya's face for cracks that weren't there. Maya straightened, her shoulders squaring as she nodded. "Ready." As they walked back to the car, her mind churned with what lay ahead. The investigation was far from over. There were still shadows to chase, powerful figures who'd snarl and claw to protect their empires. But fear didn't grip her anymore. She'd spent years proving she belonged in this fight, and now, with the silence shattered, retreat wasn't an option. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds of a nondescript office, illuminating the woman in the dark suit sitting across from Maya. Her sharp eyes glinted with a new respect, a subtle shift from the cool detachment of their earlier meetings. She'd been there from the start, handing Maya the files that cracked the case wide open, standing silently as the threads unraveled. Now she slid another folder across the table, its contents spilling secrets in black and white. "Ryan Daniels flipped faster than we expected," she said, her tone clipped but laced with satisfaction. "Names, dates, evidencino to take this further than we dreamed." Maya flipped it open, her eyes scanning the pages with practiced speed before snapping it shut. "Then let's push," she said, her voice a quiet command. The woman hesitated, leaning forward slightly. "This won't be easy. The people we're targeting, I've got influence, power." Maya didn't flinch, her gaze unwavering. "So do I." A smirk tugged at the woman's lips, admiration flickering in her eyes. "I'll set up the next meeting," she said, rising and heading for the door. She paused, glancing back. "For what it's worth, you've done more than most would dare." Maya didn't look up, her fingers tracing the folder's edge. "That's the problem," she murmured, the words heavy with the weight of a truth too long ignored. Hours later, she walked through the department, the air thick with unspoken tension. Some colleagues nodded as she passed, a grudging acknowledgement of the storm she'd unleashed. Others averted their eyes, their silence louder than any protest. No one dared challenge her outright to become a force they couldn't dismiss, a reckoning they hadn't seen coming. Stepping outside, the sunlight hit her face, warm and unyielding. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was a voicemail, age's laughter spilling through the speaker, bright and unguarded. For the first time in days, a real smile broke across her face, softening the edges of her weariness. This wasn't just about exposing corruption or toppling one crooked cop. It was about what happens when power is abused and justice is denied, about the consequences that ripple outward, staining lives like ink on fragile paper. It was about taking that power back, not with fists or fury, but with the courage to stand firm when everything screamed to give up. Maya's fight was a testament to that, a lesson carved in the scars of her struggle. Accountability isn't a gift bestowed in quiet. Corners, it's a demand forged in the open by those who refuse to bow, no matter the cost.